Today we're going to talk about a new research paper that just came out in the field of neuroscience, where these scientists try to shed light on the flexible yet context-sensitive behavior of neurons by focusing not only on the neural activities, but also on the spikes of the neurons that they emit while engaged in specific assemblies. These assemblies are transient groups of neurons that fire together in tightly coordinated patterns, like, for example, musicians do, where they come together for a brief movement in a symphony. And so, by uncovering the rich choreography of neural assemblies, this research paper brings us closer to the understanding of how the brain thinks, how it adapts, and how essentially it creates. It reminds us that intelligence lies not only in the parts, but in the dance that they perform together. And towards the end of this video, we're going to talk about how we could potentially use these insights to use it in the artificial neural networks and the future of humanoids. In the rich architecture of the primate brain, no region is more pivotal to complex behavior than the frontal cortex. This part of the brain is central to decision making, goal setting, and action execution. But how exactly does it coordinate its neural machinery to translate a goal into an action? Recent research has opened a remarkable window to this transformation, revealing that neurons operate not in isolation, but as part of a dynamic collective known as assemblies. The traditional view of neuronal coding often treats each neuron as an independent unit. Researchers typically analyze the entirety of a neuron's spiking activity to determine what stimulus or variable it might be encoding. This full spike analysis has guided decades of neuroscience. However, it obscures a deeper layer of computation that emerges when neurons operate in coordinated ensembles. When the primate brain is examined through the lens of these assemblies, neurons begin to tell a very different story. A neuron that seems irrelevant when judged in isolation can in fact play a critical role when it comes to part of a coordinated group. This observation challenges the neuron's doctrine that has guided cognitive neuroscience for over a century and pushes us towards a system-based understanding of brain computation. Just as a chess grandmaster can manage multiple games simultaneously, neurons can participate in multiple assemblies, each serving a different cognitive goal. This flexible participation of these neurons allow the brain to use the same hardware, in this case a neuron, for different purposes depending on the task at hand. The coding properties of a neuron are therefore not static but dynamically reconfigurable. This dynamic coding contrasts with a more static coding observed during periods of memory retention, for example, where neurons hold information in a relatively fixed configuration. During active transformation, such as when planning and executing a goal, for example, neuronal assemblies undergo rapid reconfiguration. This flexibility is essential for complex behaviors that require adaptation to shifting demands and environments. One of the more striking findings of this paper is that even non-discriminative neurons, those which do not appear to encode task-relevant information on their own, can acquire selectively when embedded in an assembly. This means that the collective behavior of the group of neuron gives rise to properties that cannot be predicted from its individual parts, a hallmark of emergent phenomena. These research findings resonate with previous research that we also talked about in systems neuroscience, showing that the meaning of a neuron's activity is often contingent on its context. For example, studies in the hippocampus have revealed that place cells fire in different environments depending on the broader activity patterns of the surrounding neurons. Now, similar principles are being uncovered in the frontal cortex during complex decision making as well. The implications of these research findings are profound. They suggest that neural computation is inherently relational. Just as words derive their meaning not in isolation, but within the syntax and semantics of a sentence, neurons derive their meaning from the assembly in which they fire. This could fundamentally reshape how we interpret neural data. From a computational perspective, this implies that the brain is not simply a collection of independent processes, but a network of reconfigurable circuits. Each neuron is a node that can participate in multiple sub-networks depending on context. This reusability may be one of the reasons where biological brains are so efficient in and adaptable in processing and communicating information. There are strong parallels here with distributed computing and dynamic reconfiguration in artificial neural networks as well. In AI, for example, models like transformers dynamically allocate attention across different parts of the input depending on the task itself. Similarly, the brain appears to dynamically reallocate neural resources through assembly reconfiguration. This particular research also offers insight into neural bases of creativity and flexibility. The ability to combine and recombine neuronal assemblies allow for novel patterns of activity that can generate new behaviors, just as jazz musicians, for example, improvise by assembling familiar motifs into new ways. The brain appears to improvise cognition through flexible neural compositions. This is more or less like a neural version of composability, where small reusable units can be combined to produce a vast repertoire of functions. This principle is deeply embedded in both biology and software engineering, and now appears to be a key feature for cortical computation as well. In the context of behavior, this assembly-based coding may be critical for rapid adaptation. Imagine for example, a primate navigating a task where the goal shifts from one moment to the next. A static neural code would be too rigid in this case. Dynamic assemblies, however, allow the brain to fluidly update its internal state to match the external demands. Interestingly enough, the timing of assembly formation appears to align with cognitive transitions. During goal action transformation, there is a burst of reconfiguration as neurons shift from encoding abstract goals to motor intentions. This temporal alignment underscores the functional significance of assemblies as the real time scaffolds of cognition. This particular study's finding also provides a fresh lens through which to view psychiatric and neurological disorders, for example. If cognitive flexibility depends on the ability to dynamically form and dissolve assemblies, the disruption in this process could potentially underlying conditions like schizophrenia, autism, or even Parkinson's disease. On a broader evolutionary level, this flexible assembly architecture of neurons might be one of the key innovations that distinguish primate and especially human cognition. The capacity to recombine mental elements in novel way is central to language, planning, and imagination, for example, all hallmarks of intelligence, higher intelligence within humans. This architecture also supports the idea that cognition is not localized to specific neurons, but emergence from pattern of interactions among the neurons. The brain is not a map of fixed functional modules, but a dynamic landscape of shifting coalitions, each arising and dissolving as needed. This paper also invites new methodology approaches in neuroscience, for example. So instead of averaging activity across trials of neural populations, scientists might analyze fine-grained patterns of co-activation to uncover hidden codes that only emerges in specific configuration. Technologies like high-density electrophysiological activities and calcium imaging make it possible to capture these particular transient assemblies at scale. Combined with machine learning tools, researchers are beginning to decode the grammar of neural assemblies in real time. There's also a growing interest in the energy efficiency of such dynamic coding in neurons. Reusing neurons across multiple functions may reduce metabolic costs while maximizing computational output. This could be a key principle not only in brains, but in the design of future AI systems. This paper also moves us a little bit closer to understanding the brain not as a machine of isolated parts, but as a society of interacting agents. Each neuron plays multiple roles, none of which can be understood outside the larger structure of coordinated activity. Just as the chess where the master juggles different opponents with different strategies, the brain juggles multiple assemblies, each encoding a different aspects of the task at hand. Mastery lies not in rigid planning, but in fluid adaptation within the brain. This paper also opens up new philosophical questions about identity, agency, and consciousness, for example. If even the meaning of a neuron is context based, what does that say about the stability of the self itself? Perhaps we too are emergent patterns shaped by the assemblies of thought, memory, and perception. In sum, the dynamic coding observed in these primate brains, for example, hints us that the general principle of intelligence, whether it's biological or artificial, is not the number of elements that matters, but the way that they are organized and reorganized in real time is what truly matters. Flexibility, not just capacity, is the hallmark of a smart system, and by uncovering the rich choreography of neuronal assemblies within brains, this particular paper brings us closer to understanding how the brain thinks, adapts, as well as creates. It reminds us that the intelligence lies not in the parts, but in the dance that they perform together. Now, in the current AI models, especially when it comes to deep learning systems, individual units are usually specialized for a single task or feature representation. Once trained, their internal structure is relatively fixed. This is in contrast to the brain's assembly-based approach that we just discussed, where the same neuron may participate in different coalitions depending on the task at hand. Emulating this flexibility in artificial neural systems could lead to a more generalized and adaptable intelligence. Recent work in machine learning, such as mixture of experts models and attention-based transformers, has already started exploring dynamic routing of information. For example, these architectures activate only a subset of units or layers depending on the context, loosely mirroring the concept of dynamic assembly reconfiguration of the brain. This modular activation not only improves efficiency, but also opens the door to task-dependent reuse of computational resources, much like the neurons within the brain in Assemblies do. On the other hand, in the domain of robotics and humanoid systems, these insights could guide the development of more fluid behavior generations of robots. Rather than relying on static, rule-based modules for vision, locomotion, or speech, future humanoids might dynamically form functional modules akin to neural assemblies based on real-time demands and sensory goals. This would potentially enable more natural integration of perception, memory, and action within the future of robots as well as humanoid systems. One realistic pathway is the incorporation of spiking neural networks, SNNs, that we've already talked about, which already operate closer to biological principles than traditional deep learning models, for example, combined with mechanisms for assembly detection and reconfiguration. SNN-based systems could potentially emulate the temporal dynamics observed in cortical networks, for example. These systems would not just react to stimuli, but reconfigure their internal structure based on context, mimicking the goal action transformation seen in primates' brains. Potentially, the implementation of such architecture in hardware is becoming more feasible with neuromorphic computing platforms, for example, that we've talked about in the past. For example, chips like Intel's chips or IBM's True North are designed to handle event-based computation and could potentially, in principle, support dynamic assembly coding discussed. As hardware catches up with theory, these biologically inspired ideas may become central to the next generation of embodied artificial neural networks as well as robotics. In this way, the frontier of neuroscience is not merely a mirror of understanding ourselves, it is also a blueprint for building artificial systems that are not just intelligent but flexible, context aware, and dynamically self organizing. Just as the brain orchestrates its neurons in assemblies to adapt to a changing world, so too might future humanoids learn to dance to the rhythms of their movements fluidly, intelligently, and perhaps even creatively. That's all I had for today. Hope you liked this paper and you hope you found it as exciting as I did. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.